Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Press Club. It's a real pleasure for the Institute for European Environmental Policy to have you all here today to discuss a pressing issue of our time. And yes, that's another one. My name is Antoine. I'm the research director at IEEP, and it's my honor to be your host for this event this morning. For those who, for some reasons, could not make it this morning, no worries. The event will be recorded and published on the IEEP website, so you will have plenty of time to listen to my wonderful accents once again, if you wish to do so.
It says you're in a practice session. So.
Yeah, all right. Very good. Okay. Very good. Thank you. So, without further ado, we are now living the age of the twin transition, green and digital, to deliver a net zero Europe by 2050. The aim of this transition, what it is to limit the worst effect of climate change, which we are currently already experiencing, but also to drive the adaptation capacities of our societies to this new reality, which will happen to some extent, no matter what we do. Among this flurry of objectives, digital, green, mitigation, adaptation, there is one constant. Future economies and societies will rely heavily on a limited number of well-identified Earth resources that are scarcely found in nature. We now call these resources critical raw materials. Lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt. They are at the heart of the twin transition as they support the production of electric vehicles and batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, but also cell phones, for instance. They are labeled critical as they're only a finite and usually quite scarce resource, and they're usually concentrated in a small number of countries, while their demand is expected to increase dramatically in the future. For instance, demand for rare earths, for instance, are expected to increase 5 to 12 times by 2050. Lithium, 60 times. So that's in this context of scarcity and needness that on 16th of March 2023, the European Commission published its proposal for a European Critical Raw Material Act, ECRMA. This proposed legislation is now at the trilogue phase, which is the discussions between the main European institutions, that is the European Commission, the European Council, the European Parliament. They are getting together to agree on a final version of the text. Its chief objective of the ECRMA is for the EU to eventually be in capacity to source enough CRMs to meet our expected increased demand, whether this happens through domestic extraction, which has significant environmental impact, external supply, which creates new dependencies toward third countries, or recycling. And this morning, we would like to focus on this last point. Recycling, reprocessing, reuse of CRMs. Such processes are absolutely crucial to improve our resilience and satisfy the EU's growing demand for clean technologies while remaining within planetary boundaries. So, eventually, is the ECRMA fit for purpose to meet this objective? We recently published a policy brief, which I invite you to read, of course, in which we explore some of these circularity aspects that are contained in the proposal. And we have gathered here today a stellar group of speakers to discuss this topic from different angles. But before we get to that, I would like to leave the floor to Emma Watkins, our very own senior policy analyst and the lead author of that policy brief on the circularity aspects of the ECRMA. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Antoine. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm a bit shorter than Antoine was, so just adjusting the microphones. So yeah, as Antoine mentioned, I am one of the co-authors of the briefing that I'm going to speak about today. I think maybe we need to switch presentations. Just wait for that to happen. Great, thank you. So yes, I'm going to talk about the briefing that we've prepared. It's the first briefing in a project that's looking at wider aspects, also related to the CRMA. But this one, as we said, is dealing with circularity in particular. So just to introduce the kind of structure of the briefing, firstly, we summarize the circularity measures that are included in the proposal. We then go on to outline the state of play, so a bit of background on the kind of state of play of circular critical raw materials in the EU. So to give a bit of kind of background context, we then try to identify what we see as some of the gaps between what's contained in the proposal and the EU's overall circular economy ambition. And then we take a look at some recommendations to try to address those gaps and ensure that circularity is promoted better going forward in the implementation of the Act. So contained in the CRMA proposal, there are measures related to circularity already. The main aim, obviously, is to secure a stable and strategic supply of critical raw materials within the EU for these twin transitions that Antoine mentioned. And there's also an aim in there to improve the circularity and sustainability of CRMs. But what we were trying to do is to look at kind of how that's being done in a more practical level. The main circular economy related target that's contained in the proposal is to achieve 15% of the EU's annual consumption of strategic raw materials through EU recycling capacity by 2030. So that's kind of the headline target. It's worth noting that in the trilogue discussions, there's some negotiation around that target. So the Council and the Parliament both think that should be more ambitious. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out in the final text. The measures included in the proposal linked to circular economy include obviously adopting the list of CRM recovery potential products, so products that have a high potential to recover CRMs. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the member states increasing collection rates, recycling capacities and treatment. We'll come back to that later. And development of plans to recover CRMs also from extractive waste, so kind of earlier in the process, before the product kind of phase. And then some measures specifically on permanent magnets, looking at facilitating their recyclability and also ensuring that there's minimum recycled content in those products. So the state of play on CRMs in the EU, as Antoine also already mentioned, the Commission's predicted this unprecedented increase in the demand for these materials for the twin transitions. And it's worth noting that the EU is very heavily reliant on a very small number of suppliers, some of which maybe don't have the best kind of political relationships with, so they're potentially unreliable in their supply. Of the 34 critical raw materials in the latest list, currently only 10 of those have 10% or more of their demand met through secondary raw materials. So there's obviously still a way to go to meet that 15% target. And the average end-of-life recycling input rates, the amount of secondary raw material that's meeting demand as a whole for CRMs, is currently only 8.3%. So again, quite far from that 15% target. And it's also worth noting that the EU is 100% reliant on imports for 11 of the 34 critical raw materials on the critical raw material list. So moving on to the circularity gaps that we feel more could potentially be done about within the proposal or its implementation. We've identified 5 that we think are particularly important. So they relate to product design, to information on the composition of products and the materials contained within them, the low collection and recycling rates of these critical raw materials, inadequate recycling facilities and technologies, and economic viability of recycling is also a challenge. And then finally, high levels of resource use. So I'll just very quickly talk through each of those in turn. The first relates to product design. So the problem here is that if products aren't designed at the beginning to kind of last longer or to be able to have their materials recovered at the end of their life, that can lead to those the raw materials going missing, basically, when it comes to the end of life. So we think that either within the Act or in supporting implementing acts or in some kind of guidance, it would be useful to include some consideration of exactly how to meet the eco-design requirements. So exactly how to consider the recovery potential for critical raw materials through eco-design requirements. Then obviously this is a field where there's a lot of technological advances and developments that will continue into the future. They need to be taken into account, but also it should be ensured that they're not a barrier to critical raw material circularity in the future. And then it's very important to ensure that there's coherence between the aims and objectives of the proposed Act and the existing and any future product and waste related legislation regarding promoting circularity of CRMs. So that's just making sure that there's policy coherence. On product information, the problem here is that, again, if there's a lack of information about what's contained in the product, so if people don't know that there's critical raw materials in a product, then it leads to loss of those materials. We suggest that the Act could maybe emphasize even more the value of labeling and the value of product passports in enabling circularity. So making sure that the people who need to know that the raw materials are in the products have that information. And also we suggest considering requiring that all products that contain viable recoverable amounts of critical raw materials should bear a label or product passport to make sure that that information is available. The third circularity gap relates to collection and recycling rates. The Commission has recognised that these are particularly low for some critical raw materials, so it's already recognised as a problem. Here, it's important to ensure that there's consistent application of the provisions of the proposed Act across different products and wastes, so to make sure that all the wastes and materials are captured. Then we think that consideration could be given to developing targets that are specific to individual strategic raw materials, so breaking down this 15% headline target. Obviously, that's a very technical issue and would require a lot more research than we've been able to do within this project, but just to highlight that as a suggestion. And then also, obviously, on this particular point, the proposal is placing quite a lot of weight on what the member states are doing. So trying to encourage them to improve recycling rates, collection rates, and recycling technologies. So we feel that if the EU is asking member states to do this, it would be helpful to ensure that there's funding there to support the member states in achieving those objectives. The fourth gap relates to recycling facilities and technologies. So the problem here is that currently there's inadequate recycling facilities in terms of technical capability, but also capacity. And this kind of prevents economies of scale and makes recycling of critical raw materials very high cost, which limits the potential circularity. Again, because the member states are being asked to do a lot on this, it would be useful to assess whether the existing funds are adequate, and if not, try to do something more to support the member states. This could also be done through helping to develop economies of scale for critical raw materials. So, for example, through the hubs for circularity that I mentioned in the Commission's communication. There's obviously quite a lot of guidance, BREFs, for example, already on recycling technologies, but it's important to make sure that the critical raw material recycling technologies are also captured in those BREFs and guidance to make sure that the best technologies are being applied. And then we also suggest that market-based instruments could play a role to kind of support the recovery and recycling of critical raw materials. So, for example, extended producer responsibility with modulation of fees, or potentially product materials or taxes. Again, that's an area for future research, but we think that there's some potential there. And then the final point relates to the overall high level of resource use in the EU. The EU is using much more than its kind of fair share to stay within planetary boundaries of resources in general. And to support circularity, we think it's important to also reduce that resource use, or at least, stop it from increasing too far. To do this, we suggest ensuring that progress towards reducing resource consumption is measured in absolute terms rather than a relative assessment. This is basically because even if you increase recycling of critical raw materials, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are also reducing primary resource consumption. If your demand's still going up, then your recycled content still can't meet that extra demand. There's also potential for circular business models to play a role here. So those that are focusing higher up the waste and resource hierarchy. So looking at the refuse, rethink, reduce strategies, and not just focusing on recycling, though recycling is obviously very important. And also there's more research to be done looking at setting science-based targets to reduce primary resource use in support of both the decarbonisation and dematerialisation agendas. So that's, in summary, what's contained in the proposal. If there are any kind of immediate questions, we can maybe take one or two of those, or if not, I'll hand back to Antoine. So.
I was wondering, you mentioned earlier, I think your presentation that there was zero recycling for some metals. So is that because they're not being connected, or the recycling technique is unavailable?
I wouldn't know the details of the specific kind of materials, but yeah, I think both of those issues. So the lack of collection, the lack of technologies, that also quite a lot of these materials are in very small quantities in products, which makes them harder to recover, and the economies of scale issue comes in. So I think, yeah, there's various issues, but I couldn't pinpoint one.
Perfect. Just one very short question. Is the topic of bringing in waste to be recycled from outside of Europe, so sourcing, let's say, electronic waste outside of Europe for proper recycling in Europe, is that a topic that's being discussed?
We haven't discussed it in this briefing, but in a second briefing in the project, we're looking more at the international aspects and trade-related aspects, so it could come into that briefing, I think.
My question is, why is the main reason they don't produce for longer use or like for recycle purpose? Like, and if you think like the small initiatives like Fairphone, for example, will help this act or not?
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. I think, I mean, obviously product design is the basis for everything going forward from that point. So if you're already designing for recycling and for collection, for longevity, then I think that's already helping to solve the problem. So yeah, more initiatives of that type, I think, would be useful. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Emma, for your presentation. And please do not worry, there will be more time for questions a bit later on in the process. So far, right now, we would like to start addressing, as I said before, this question and all of the points that Emma has made in her presentation and in the briefing, how to approach this angle from this question from a lot of different angles. And to help us do that, we have a stellar panel joining us this morning. If I can please ask you to join on the stage, and then we'll have a few questions and a few moderated conversation. So please welcome Eduardo Boro, who's policy officer at Reuse, which is an association of circular and social enterprises involved in the circular economy. We have Tamid Chaudhary, program manager at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, CISL. And we have Justina Balbier, Senior EU Affairs Manager and Head of the EU Office at Hydro, which is a leading aluminium and industrial company. And last, but certainly not least, we're joined this morning by Sherpa Pietikainen. Please indulge me, bear with me on the way I pronounce your names. So Sherpa Pietikainen, a member of European Parliament, who is with us remotely and who can help us discuss the main aspect of the CRMA proposal. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Okay, is this working? Yes, changing position. So my first question actually goes directly to you, Sherpa. I wanted to ask you, as you've been involved in the policy-making process of the Critical Raw Material Act, which we have been discussing already a lot this morning, can you tell us about your views on the strength and the weaknesses of the proposal as it stands, and what should the ongoing trilogue discussion focus on to improve the current state of the regulation?
Well, thank you, Lea. And unfortunately, the list of problems is longer than the list of good points. And so I'll start with the good points. And the benefits are that we are acknowledging that the EU is the most dependent area of imported raw materials and critical raw materials. And it is a good that Commission takes an action there to improve our strategic autonomy on this side. And then the rest is not so good. So it sort of forgets the main principles. And the main reason for that is that it is prepared by DG Industry. And they really have not very well talked with the DG Environment. And I don't need to have a long preach for you, even though I would like to have it, about circular economy, the resource efficiency, the tenfold resource efficiency needed, and the cascading use of the raw materials, and all that. And we have made a rather huge, not perfect, but a large package of regulations. So then what this starts with is linear worldview, that it is linear, the expected need of consumption of raw materials, critical raw materials, point number one. Point number two, if you think of this 15% recycling target, it's out of 80s, this thinking. And now we are talking in circular economy about 80% recycling targets, as this is the minimum what we need to get to really achieve this tenfold resource efficiency. And what I made as proposals to change that did not pass on the process is that first, you should have this kind of a further look. What are the emerging new technologies? So you should design out of the waste. And to give you an example, there's a huge lithium boom in mining in Europe, because we have the lithium batteries at the moment. And we all know that the solid state natrium batteries are coming, and with the fast pace, we are going to have already next year and the year after 6 or 7 car makers having these lithium, replacing the lithium batteries with these solid state batteries. So actually we are encouraging the bad old technologies, and think what mistake you do if you open up a mine that actually is serving the old-fashioned technology. Then you would need to have this kind of compulsory circularity test with a target of 80% of collection, reuse, and recycling of the rare materials. And that really would mean that you first look if you need the materials. Secondly, you make sure that you take all of the materials back. Plus, then it is the urban mining using the old mines and the existing materials there. And then only after that, you start considering whether you need the mining. Then you look the interest comparison, because if you know you can have forest and you can have agriculture and you can have tourism, you can have many kinds of livelihoods permanently if they are on sustainable basis. But if you open a mine, that is a mine that serves 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, even 80 years. But after that, that is only a environmental deficit. So you should use extra strong precautionary principle on these cases. And then on the contrary, what the Commission is proposing, the Parliament was voting in favor, and the Council is very supportive, is that you ease up the permitting process and the environmental impact assessment. And the environmental impact assessment should include these other options, what I was explaining about, and the recycling and the interest comparisons. And it never should be combined with the permitting, and this is what happens here. Plus then on the permitting process, it is this kind of a speed channel if that mining is considered to be a part of this European critical raw material initiative. And I guess Finns are going to, for example, run to have the status, not to object it. And that's why it is the riskier path. You do not increase, you decrease the hearings and the possibilities to take up the cases on courts. So actually, you are putting a prioritizing factor for the mining de facto, and very clearly it is said, and it can be made in nature conservation and natura areas, and it can be made even though there would be clear local objections, for example, the municipality objections. So I really am not happy with this. And then again, on my proposal, then if you have the mining, it would need to have 5 elements. Firstly, it should be closed mining. Thirdly, it should have the obligation to repair all the damages that are possible to repair what it has done. So, and it should use the processes and principles of putting the nature back, not leaving as it is. And it should have the same norms of cleaning the water for the dumps and for the emissions on the air than the other industries have. And none of these principles, what I mentioned, are on there. And it is not actually improving on the trialogues, what I have heard. And actually, the scope of the rare earths, the needed raw materials is broad, and for example, aluminium is included in there. And then to make you, I'm sorry about this, not so happy, I just heard that the Commission is bullying and pushing the platform to make a taxonomy for sustainable mining so that these mines could get the claims of green mining if they follow this Commission's strategy. And well, this is pretty unheard of. So I really don't know what went wrong with us when this is coming out, but this is really serious. I do not know if we could do anything during the trialogues because it's really speed tracking there. We are going to finalize it pretty soon, firstly. And secondly, there was so overwhelming support for the proposal in the Parliament and in the Council. And I just need to, sorry, frankly, to say from some of my colleagues that tend to be very environmentally conscious, that they did not read this proposal very well. And so there was quite astonishing support. Well, this was what was my comments for the debate, and happy to take a part on discussion later.
Thank you so much, Shepa, for your words. We understand that the situation is quite serious. The trilogue conversation is still happening, so hopefully some of the points that you've mentioned can still be taken on board. Noted your point that you've made on the current focus of the CRMA being more on loosening the rules for domestic mining and extraction processes in the EU, whether through permitting or environmental impact assessments. I think the very important point that you've made is with the examples of compulsory circularity tests that pertains more to the kind of implementation and the monitoring of the legislation once it's actually out there. And for the EU policymaking to not just limit itself to setting targets, but actually telling us how to do this. How do we get to these targets? That's an actual, perhaps sometimes the shortcomings in many EU legislation that could be addressed through some of these concrete examples that you've mentioned. And eventually, I think we can all agree that something extremely important that you mentioned is mining, although perhaps necessary sometimes, should be the last resort eventually, because there is environmental impact that's going to be there. It could be mitigated to some extent, but there will be an environmental impact. So perhaps it will still be necessary, but it should be a last resort. So thank you so much, Shepa. I will get back to you for some additional question if you don't mind. But yeah, for the time being, please let me turn to our other panelists, and I would like to ask Eduardo first from Reuse. So you've been also following the policy files, the CRMA, closely. Could you also share your elements of what you think are missing from the proposed regulation, and how could the trilogue address these shortcomings? So essentially the same question as for Sherpa. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Indeed. Thanks a lot, for inviting me to speak, but also for the excellent paper that I had the occasion to read. And as soon as I read that this was about the circularity gap in the CRMA, I really thought that, yeah, it's great. And it's very good that you've been working on this. And the issue is that with critical raw materials, we have actually some kind of paradox when you think about it, because we need them to ensure that, we transition towards a more sustainable society, but yet the business of procuring these materials is anything but sustainable. And it's what MEP Pietikäinen will say, of course, you can make mining greener, you should make mining greener, but you cannot make mining green, because mining is not a green activity. There's a lot of issues regarding land use, regarding the risk of toxic chemicals being released, and the enormous quantity of waste, some of which is hazardous and sometimes also radioactive. So we're talking really of an environmental catastrophe that also has big social implications, because there is also the displacement of populations and so on. So indeed, there is something that should be done, but so far, most of the actual strategy, this has been a supply side strategy. So concentrating, increasing extraction in so-called sacrifice zones, whether inside or outside Europe, where you have already vulnerable population, where usually rural, disadvantaged communities, and then you can just, extract there. So once you extract there, then everyone can use the materials, but this doesn't really look like a transition to sustainable development to me. What we are missing is the demand side. So really reducing our dependence on our need for critical raw materials. And this is where the circular economy comes into play. And I think that this is the only actual sustainable solution to come out of this paradox. The European Commission does realize the importance of circular economy. If you look at the proposal, there is a whole section of circularity. But if you look closely, the focus is only on recycling once again. And don't get me wrong, recycling is an important part of the circular economy. It's fundamental, but it's not the circular economy in itself. And it's not enough for us to really solve the issue. This is because many critical raw materials are hard to recycle. We have materials like aluminum, which have with a very high recovery rate. But then you have rare earths, which are also used in very small concentration. And it's really, really hard technologically and economically to recover these kind of materials. So I think we should go back to the 3 R's. So reduce, then reuse, and then recycle in this order. And the proposal has a lot on the recycle, but there could be a bit more on the reduce and reuse. And I'm happy to say that actually the vote in plenary from the European Parliament did improve massively on these elements. And we really found a cross-party approach from Ms. Pietikainen parties, the EPP, but also from S&D, from the Greens. This was really a cross-party issue, and it's very good that this was the case. And for instance, on reuse, we had, there is an obligation on the information on permanent magnets available for recyclers. But we went there and we say, why just recyclers? Because repairers could use that information to actually repair these products. There was also something on skills that is actually something that we don't talk about, but the big issue is that there is a shortage of repair skills. And when you think about it, if you know how to repair a washing machine, this is not something we do, but we are creating the jobs of tomorrow. Because if you know how to repair a washing machine, it's easier to learn how to repair a wind turbine. Because in the end, they both use permanent magnets, rotor embedded in motors. And it's not something we always say, but it's something important. And both the Council and the EP agree on this point, which is very, very good. Then we also had something specifically on ensuring that not all the material that is wasted goes into recycling. Because you can take some of these materials, some of these products, you can check if they're repairable or reusable, and you can repair them, you can give them a new life, and so you guarantee the maximum efficiency of resources. And finally, and the most important part, perhaps, is the reduction, the reduce aspect. In the Parliament, there is a mechanism for the mitigation in demand increase, which is linked to benchmark. We don't need to go into the technicalities. Perhaps it's not enough. Maybe we do need some kind of reduction in the future, because it's true that we are using way above our fair share of resources, but it's still a massive improvement over the Commission proposal, where this aspect, unfortunately, was not tackled. And it's hard, of course, to talk about demand mitigation, but I would start by really cutting down on our wasteful consumption and our throwaway society, because we have products that have no reason to be on the EU market. One clear example are these disposable e-cigarettes or vapors, where you have these super small batteries, which are, very hard to recover. These products, they have a very short life. They're completely unrepairable, meant to be just used once. Usually they're just thrown away in the municipal waste too. So you have recycling facilities that have one fire a week, if it goes well, sometimes more in a day. So yeah, I really think we need to do more. And I'm happy to say that the Parliament draft massively improves on some of these points. And I think it's a good place to start on how to improve the proposal. And I hope we'll get something better this way during the trilogues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. And yes, well, actually, a round of applause. So I see a lot of agreements on the points that were made. They reflect a lot on what Sherpa has been mentioning as well. The idea is that it's not about just recycling, that recycling should be also some sort of a last resort. We have reuse and we have reduce that should come first. Reuse with some obligation of information. You mentioned the example of the permanent magnets. It also reflects one of the circularity gap that were highlighted by Emma in the presentation and in the briefing, the lack of information, sometimes the transparency around these issues to make eventually reuse possible, even possible for in the first place. And then reduce, indeed, the demand side mitigation measures. It's now more and more part of the debate, but we're not quite there yet as to how to embed, to enshrine such principles into many EU policy processes. But the CRMA is certainly one of the very good examples to start. So moving away from the policy process and into kind of the industry side of things, how do things happen concretely at the moment for the industry? I would like to turn to Justina for a second. I would like to ask you, how do you see hydro contributing to the Commission's objectives that are that we've just talked about on the CRMA? How does the proposed legislation help you get there?
So thank you for having me. I'll start with a few words about hydro. We are the largest European aluminium company. We are present along the whole value chain, from mining through smelting, processing of aluminium down to recycling. And as a matter of fact, we are one of the largest aluminium recyclers in Europe. On top of that, we are also investing in battery material businesses, synthetic graphite, lithium, silicon as an anode material, and in battery recycling. So why is the CRM Act important for us? It's exactly because of our line of activities along the whole value chain. and also because of the importance of Europe for our business. So we have operations in 20 EU member states, which means plants, basically. 40% of our employees are based here in the EU. So you can imagine the EU is very important for us strategically and commercially. Now, as you know, the objectives of the CRM Act is to provide secure and sustainable supply of raw materials. And of course, we see our role as Hydro as a producer of primary materials and also as a recycler. And the importance of the CRM Act, in our opinion and for us, is threefold. The first is its symbolic importance, which is the reason why we are so happy to see aluminium on the list of strategic raw materials. It is we are very grateful to the Parliament and the Council for supporting this. And the reason is that basically it is a message from policymakers saying, yes, we do believe in the future of aluminium in Europe, and we do not take it for granted, actually, as the industry. Second type of impacts are, of course, tangible impacts. It's the faster permitting processes, hopefully funding, so that's very positive. And thirdly, there are also some impacts which are something in between tangible and symbolic. Take, for example, the benchmarks for mining, processing, and recycling. In our opinion, the actual numbers matter less than the fact that they are there, in the sense that they send a signal to investors, a positive signal to investors, and they also sort of show the direction of travel. And in this sort of sustainable supply of raw materials, of course, recycling is going to play a huge role. We recognize that, especially local recycling here in Europe. It will decrease import dependence, it will improve resilience of value chains, and on top of that, it will have an impact on CO2 emissions. So, for example, take aluminium recycling. If you recycle it, you can save up to 95% of energy in comparison to producing primary aluminium. So the benefits are huge. So we are very happy to see recycling as a part of the CRM Act.
Thank you very much, Justina. And indeed, that's kind of it reflects the point that I was making, that okay, sometimes the EU setting targets might not be enough, because sometimes we need some more guidance as to how we get there. And we had some concrete examples from previous panelists on that. But no matter, even if it's not there, it's still a signal. It's still a way, it relates to the taxonomy, which is not binding, but it gives a signal, it gives an incentive to investors and to the industry side to actually get geared toward that particular objective. We know that can take time, so the earlier the better to get on track. So thank you for the point that you've made to remind us of this. Again, last but certainly not least, I hope you'll indulge us. We're a think tank, we're a research institute. We've heard from the European Parliament, we've heard from Reuse, we've heard from Hydro, but I would get back to some sort of a research kind of aspect of things. And I would like to turn to Tamil from CISL. I wanted to ask you how the findings from the circularity and the CRMA briefing, which we just discussed, relate to your own research, whether you think, or both our research kind of align, if you find some discrepancies, some gaps, or and eventually how your research point on how to get to a greater circularity aspect for the legislation.
So hi, my name is Tamil Chowdhury. I'll just introduce myself. Thank you so much for the invitation and to speak on this. So it's probably worth me just saying a little bit about what we do. So we're part of the University of Cambridge, but we have an office here in Brussels. And so what our role is through some of our organizations, business organizations, we bring together progressive businesses to advocate on EU policy. So we have the Materials and Products Task Force, Hydro being one of the members. And so what we look to do is bring some of this research side, but also bringing the business side as well. So yeah, it was really great to hear the presentation, and thanks a lot to Emma and yourselves. I think I don't want to repeat too much to make this useful for you all. I think a lot of it does align. I think for those of us probably in this room who've been a little bit into the circular space, there's a lot there that I think, excuse me, is very logical. I would say there's a few things that kind of struck me that I think we didn't really talk about so much. The resource consumption point, I think, is an important one. I think it's one that it's a touchy topic, but the sooner we start talking about it, the more that we genuinely look at it. Well, you know, we do have a limited amount of resources on this earth, and I think we do have to come to terms to that. So it's great to have that as part of this in this short paper that you've done. And I also note that the gentleman asking a little bit about the first question about the different recycling rates. So what our report looked at, I mean, there's so many critical raw materials. There's a whole list and an annex, and then there's a strategic raw materials. We just picked a couple, working with partners in the Wuppertal Institute. So we looked at rare earth elements, lithium and bauxite, which is used for aluminium. Kind of for this point, because the aggregate target of 15% or whether it moves to 20% really varies. I mean, like in the example of aluminium, it's actually way higher because there's a really good system. Rare earth elements, so we have one member, Signify, that do a lot on lighting, and for them, you use so little of it, for example, in a product, that it's really inefficient to try and dig it up and recycle it. It's just not, it doesn't make sense economically. Lithium, you're seeing more opportunities to recycling, and you're seeing more technologies. So I guess the thing that we found is that it's important to see this as a bit more of a case-by-case basis on the material. I think it's quite easy to be like, okay, raw materials, you know, they're all raw. Reality is that they're used very differently, and the ability to recycle is very different. And sometimes it's not going to be, no matter how technologically advanced, there are some things like lithium where, okay, great, you know, technology is going to help here, but with something like rare earth elements, it's a lot trickier. So then, you know, how do we square that circle? I think the points that we're making here is, this is where it's important to be a lot more holistic when we talk about circular economy. I think it's already been mentioned by Eduardo about the way that the original proposal was looked at. I mean, my reading was, it said it was circular proposals, but it was a recycling target, and then said member states ought to figure something out for themselves. And it didn't really go much further than that. So actually, this is the point where it's like, well, how can we reduce the amount of times we use something like if it's a raw material that is really hard to recycle, let's actually put that in and factor that in and see how it can be done differently. So it was also great to see a bit about the product design. I suppose moving away a little bit from the report, and I suppose just my understanding the interactions and where this has come from, because I think it's helpful to understand this a little bit, and speaking to folks in DG Grow, because I think this also gives a direction of where an influencing approach can be helpful. The original reason that DG Grow within the European Commission, I think where they got the mandate for this sort of act, it was from, I think they said it was from the European Council, and it was really about that strategic autonomy piece. You know, we need to make sure that if we have third countries, and China being one that we import a lot from, and sometimes like 100%, if they shut up shop, we're really in the mire. So that was really the focus. And I think a bit sort of belatedly, then it was like, oh, probably circularity is a thing that we ought to talk about. And I think that's a bit what Sirpa was mentioning about the fact that there could be better coordination within them. So that being the case, yes, we can, I think, advocate for sure, and we have done with our own report. And also, you know, I think as the trilogues go, of saying, okay, can we look at circularity a bit more holistically? That said, I think we are in the realities that we are at. And I think it is maybe as a slight more to not leave it too negative. I think even if the CRMA kind of progresses as it does, this isn't the only place where we're talking about some of this stuff on circularity. We've got the Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. We'll have the delegated acts for that. And there is more space to bring this. So for me, as like a broader reflection on where we're at with this debate, I think it's about really helping people understand that circularity is more than just recycling, and not just in the sort of, you know, ourselves working on sustainability, environment, and circular economy policy. But when we're talking about industrial policy, when we're talking about some of the bigger strategic sides, so it's something that we would love to see a bit more as we get into the European elections, for example, is can we have more of the circularity and a more visionary approach to, say, industrial policy as a whole? So I mean, those are broader topics. So maybe I'll leave it there. But I think it's really about helping people understand this outside of our sort of bubble on circular economy, so that it's a lot more mainstreamed.
Thank you so much, Tammy. And this gives me a very easy segue, let's say, to go back to Shirpa. So as you mentioned here, that we need to think about circularity and circular economy more holistically. I mean, we know that the EU, that there's some initiatives going on. We have the circular economy monitoring framework, we have the circular economy stakeholder platform, and yet we feel that there's still a gap in terms of how we understand and how we think about circular economy, especially from a policy-making process. So I wanted to ask you, and especially now that going into the election, that this sort of topic should take from the front stage in views for many. So Shirpa, let me get back to you. How do you think that the EU could do to actually drive this process to think his circular economy more holistically, and how it could actually embed these notions into policy frameworks in the future, for the critical materials in particular, but also in terms of industrial policy in general?
Well, this is a big and good question. And I have sort of 4 different thinkings in different directions how it can be solved. And I don't know which of them are better or worse. Firstly, and this is the integration, because we have the fish soup problem. We do not have this kind of a system thinking, and we are acting on silos. And well, this is an old story as it goes. But how to solve it? And one way would be that we would have this kind of a high-level panel where we include the council and on highest level and on ministerial level to talk about this sufficiency economy, planetary boundaries. And I'm not talking about only the background facts, but I'm talking about this reindustrialization program that was on up and go at some point, and try to identify the ways, because it needs changes in legislation in member states, in these business ecosystems, to think, okay, if that works in construction in this way, if that works in rare earths, and we know that we have batteries coming out of lithium and this and that. And now if we sort of push very hard for the already altering technology, the risk is that we actually stop the production and the development of new technologies. A bit what happened with solar panels and cars in Europe. And then this kind of a sort of a descriptive pathway roundtable roadmap, it could be one. Then the another one could be, what then about the commission after this? Who could be the next Timmermans? And at least we should put there together the resources, food, health, and environment, because that is sort of the crux of sustainability. And then if we could have this kind of a holistic view with separate commissioners under this roof, it might be prove effective. Why not then energy or some other parts? We have discussed so much of energy already that I think that there the clarity and thinking is further than what it is on these other areas. So these are just of these some thinkings, but then again, the another part is that the unions for industries are not always, because their role is difficult, the most progressive ones. So could we have an alliance of a progressive industries to speak in favor for the change and work for that in broader context than what happens, because even though I'm so disappointed because this goes so badly wrong, as I said, what we are doing, I think that we have a possibility to fix it later on by review clauses. And what we need to do is to get the forward-looking companies to have the lobbying role, not sort of a just these kind of voices of saying no that has been very typical to EU policies and industrial policies.
Thank you so much, Chimpa. Just indeed to start bringing the matter one step, let's say, higher, to think more holistically about circular economy, and with bringing in these ideas of sufficiency, demand-side measures, and so on, will eventually be crucial if we want to link them to these to planetary boundaries. Getting also on this idea of going beyond simply, let's say, recycling in terms of a policy framework, if I could turn back to Eduardo, there are other initiatives at the EU level as how circular economy measures could complement the objectives of the Critical Material Act. We have the eco-design measures that is currently on the same sort of status, let's say, in terms of process. We have the right to repair policy initiative and so on. So I was hoping that you could give us a bit of notion of how these other policy initiatives can complement the CRMA and how important they are to go beyond recycling.
Sure, yeah. I can actually give you three and across the whole life cycle, because I think it's important here to have an holistic view. So first, and perhaps most importantly, you have the ESPR, the eco-design legislation. So it's really about ensuring that all products put on the EU markets, on the EU market, are repairable and more durable. There's also a matter here of competition, because we cannot compete with cheap products that are made elsewhere with no regards to environmental and social standards. If we compete on the EU market, we should set the rules. So I think this is crucial, and that's the place, for instance, to ban these disposable cigarettes, which are really a shame, because we're also asking people, sometimes also from indigenous communities, to really wreck their way of living, and then we use these precious resources to make these absolutely crap, useless products. I don't think it's really a moral issue there. But okay, so I think ESPR, of course, it's crucial, and it can help us on many ways to ensure really that products are designed in a way to favor circularity. But then you have the use phase, and that's the right to repair part, because we have a lot of barriers to repair. You have technical barriers, sometimes put in by manufacturers to really lock the issues. But you also have, but the biggest issue is the affordability. We actually did an action in front of the European Parliament with the Right to Repair Coalition, which is a coalition of civil society and progressive businesses. And we played a game where people had to guess, the price of a part relative to the price of the actual completed item. And sometimes the price of a single spare part is higher than the price of the finished product, which of course is something that doesn't make sense. But we created a system where it's easier to, buy a product that has been made with materials mined all over the world, maybe assembled in Vietnam, shipped from China, rather than go through to the neighborhood shop and just change one part. So that's the issue we're facing. And indeed, there is a lot of room in this regard for improvement. And finally, waste, because once product become waste, now we're shifting the language to also talk about resources, because a lot of resources are in that waste. And there is the WE directive, so also WEEE, which is waste, electric and electronic equipment. And right now, again, we know that most of this WE is sent to recycling, even if this could have been repaired. There have been quite a few studies actually showing that most of the used electronic equipments you find in a recycling facility could easily be repaired, but usually we don't even check if they can be repaired. We just chuck them into these big 2 meters containers. And yeah, if they were repaired before, they're not repaired after they go through a 2 meter fault. So perhaps, also not the smartest thing. And we need to really focus more on the preparation for reuse angle. It's a technical side, but reuse is about products, and preparation for reuse is products after they become waste, after they have been discarded. And there is something here for the critical raw materials regulation too, because there is a reference to ensure that waste streams reaching CRMs go into the appropriate recycling stream, but there is nothing specifically about preparation for reuse. And what we want there is, before it's something that our members as part of the reuse network do. By the way, we have some best practices also here in Belgium. But for instance, when you're bringing your old electronic, you have someone that checks it, sees if it can be repaired, and then if it can be repaired, this product is repaired. So you keep all the resources in, you keep all the value in, the product stays in the economy, and you create jobs. We found out with data from our network that 1 ton of electronic equipment prepared for reuse can create 70 to 140 jobs, which is quite something. And we're talking about green and local jobs. And about the social enterprise sectors, most of these people are people distant from the labor market. So can be immigrants, refugees, people facing long-term unemployment, people with disabilities. And you can really bring them into society through work while also creating the skills of the future. And I think this is something quite important. So to conclude, yes, there is a lot of room for improvement, and it makes sense to act to really close the loop on across all the life cycle of these products.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, for these points, and again bringing a more of a holistic view as to the circular economy aspect of this side of the industry. I wanted to get back also to Justina. We've talked about forward-looking companies, the importance of bringing the private sector in all of these aspects, but also we've talked a lot about holistic view and then reuse and reduce and so on. But even when looking about recycling aspect, for instance, I wanted to ask you, what are currently the main hurdles for you, for your companies, for your sector, for the industry to meet the objectives and the target of the CRMA?
So I will mention 3 hurdles that we have observed. So the first one is that for new investments, we will need access to public funding. And we were a bit disappointed to see that the CRMA did not propose a separate dedicated pool of funding for raw material projects. But the problem is wider because the EU has probably one of the most complex public funding regimes. There is very little predictability, especially, but also very little transparency. In my EU Affairs Office, we get questions from colleagues, what could be available as funding for this or that project? And the honest answer is we do not know because the information is dispersed and it's not easy to decrypt, what is available in which geography, from which tools can be combined, what is the state aid intensity, and so on. Now, the second hurdle that we faced is the unlevel playing field. We are used to competition, and we will be faced with competition, especially from China. And that's not a problem in itself. The problem starts when we see unfair trade practices. And in such cases, we need the Commission to react promptly and to use trade defense measures. Also at the threat of injury stage, do not wait until the injury is done, because then it is too late. Look what happened with magnesium production in Europe, it's gone. The third hurdle that I would like to mention, and here I will elaborate a bit more, are the counterproductive policy incentives in other dossiers, so beyond the CRM Act. So policymakers need to make sure that other policies do not undermine the objectives of the CRM Act. And here we have a negative example of CBAM, which I'm sure you are all familiar with. Currently, CBAM does not make a distinction between aluminium, which is recycled from end-of-life scrap, and between aluminium, which is recycled from industrial scrap. So both of these aluminium types, they are assigned 0 carbon footprint. And this, we believe, at Hydro, is undermining the whole purpose of CBAM, and it's undermining the stance of aluminium in Europe. But what does it mean in practice? Because I know this is very technical and very abstract. So there, in practice, you might be aware there are 2 types of scrap. There is the maybe easier to understand the end of life scrap. So your old phone or your old car, which you use for many years and then you discard it and we recycle it. But there is also pre-consumer industrial scrap, which has not, as the name suggests, it has not reached the consumer yet. For example, you take a car door factory. So to produce a car door, you take aluminum sheets, you cut out a door, you cut out some spaces for the window and the electronics. And what you get out of this process is a door, and you can get out of it like 20, 30, 40% of aluminum scrap, which is industrial scrap. And it is a sort of a no-brainer that we need to recycle everything, right? So that's very clear. But what we see is that industrial scrap is recycled, because industrial scrap, there are very strong economic incentives to recycle it. You know, it is clean, it is sorted, you know where it is coming from. So the system there is good. It's working fine. What policy needs to support is really the recycling of post-consumer end-of-life waste and scrap, which is more difficult to recycle, because it is mixed. It needs to be sorted, it needs to be shredded, it needs to be cleaned up, and so on. So it is essential for policymakers to make a distinction between these two types of recycling, between industrial scrap recycling and between end-of-life recycling. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, what you get is, in the best case, you get greenwashing and lack of transparency. In the worst case, what you get is you undermine your very own policies, and you basically lead to industrial inefficiencies, because the more inefficient the industrial process is, the more pre-consumer industrial scrap you get. And just to please bear with me, I will share a story of how this affects you as a consumer. So imagine that you want to buy some nice aluminum coffee cups, and you go to a store and you pick up a cup, and you see at the bottom it's written 100% aluminum recycled content. Very nice, right? And then you take another glass, another cup, and it's written 50% recycled aluminum content. So if this is something important to you, you will probably choose the one which is 100% recycled. But unless it is specified that this comes from post-consumer scrap, it might very well be just made from industrial waste, which just went from one factory to another factory. But you, as a consumer, you do not think about that. So was it recycled? Was this scrap recycled? Yes, it was absolutely recycled. But is this what you think you're buying? I don't think so.
Thank you so much, Justina. And indeed, you've just covered two of the main points that we always come across when you talk about circular economy processes. And there's someone that from the transition in general and circular economy transition in particular, there's going to be a significant level of investments that are required. So where does the money come from, essentially, to actually support this sort of transformation? We know that industry can face a lot of complexities, for better or worse. But also on the idea of classification and transparency. And okay, again, today we're not going to talk about trade so much, because there's another briefing, there's another event coming up specifically to look at these topics. But when we look about international trade relations and circular economy, classification, transparency, listing, actually having access to that information and differentiating between products and processes is absolutely key, and yet potentially one of the main challenges at this stage. So we will be sure to get back on that particular point. Going back to Tamil, again, similar questions on the opportunities and challenges for the business sector. You've mentioned that you've collaborated a lot with the forward-looking industry actors, and some sort of question: opportunities and challenges for the business sector to increase the reuse and reduce and recycle aspect of CRMs.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Justine has just illustrated very well. I think when we look at this from a policy perspective, I think we can kind of flatten it in terms of the actual details. And when you're in the nitty-gritty, when the intention is good, that doesn't always necessarily translate, because and I think it's an imperfect world of policymaking, and I'm not sure that sometimes I think this is just part of it, where we put something that's quite high level, but then in practice can actually have adverse effects, even if nobody really wants that. So, I mean, I think in terms of on things of challenges, I suppose the point with okay, let me give an example actually. So I had the privilege at Really, a really interesting guy. I mean, we had I think one of the companies that works in CLG Europe, our wider sort of group, is IKEA, Inca IKEA, and you know, I actually met the CEO was in town. And you know, when you're hearing from a company that size and they're just saying, okay, even we realize that we can't do this alone, it's quite striking, because I think sometimes we can look at these big businesses as, okay, well, you know, you've got the power and the means, but actually when you're looking at a whole supply chain system, it can't be done in isolation, and that's where it's really important with the signals. And to maybe give an example, if you're further downstream, let's say a company that is, I know, for example, when we had the release of our report, Volvo Cars was one of the companies, not part of our group, but they've been doing a lot on this space. And yeah, let's say that you do want to get and start producing, or there's other companies out there, you know, Polestar, they want to create a, you know, fossil-free 0% emissions car. Well, they don't actually know if the steel is even there being created. And so the important thing is to actually see this from a, yeah, I guess just a wider perspective on the supply chain. So that's, I think, a challenge. I think, as Justine says, you know, understanding where the policy direction really is going, I think that can be quite difficult. I think it's difficult for us that do this full time, let alone, I think, for a business, and we're not even talking about smaller businesses where, you know, I think that gets even more confusing. So I think those are the challenges, or some of them. I mean, there's plenty more, but I suppose not to, again, let's see the opportunities. I think the circular economy does give a real opportunity, I think, for business and European business. So some other members, say Rockwell, the Danish company that do high grade insulation, for example, there is this space to have this more differentiated product that is more sustainable and is kind of fitting more our strengths internationally, in the sense of, you know, higher quality, higher standards. And I think there's a real business opportunity in that space. To give some other examples, I think this higher focus on circularity, and the more we can encourage it, can come some really innovative solutions. You know, how we're using different waste materials. In Cambridge, we've done things like circular economy disruptors and accelerators for very, you know, really looking at some of the startup size. And for example, I know someone looking at how you use the waste material from breweries, and actually that's just a resource that gets thrown away, but they could use that actually as material. And yeah, I think there is a space for a big creativity here. The one other thing I would mention, and this was a report we actually did a year ago, on this point of the eco design for sustainable products regulation has something around digital product passport. We've seen it in the batteries regulation as well. And the idea of that is to essentially have something like a QR code that can give information about transparency, etc. I don't think it's going to be a simple thing to legislate for, but that's a really interesting example where you can actually create new business models. So a lot in that accelerator, some of the people who are doing some of this work, whether internally, and I think, if I recall correctly, Hydro as well, internally, I think you've got a system with piloting digital product passports, am I right? Okay. I'm glad I got that right. And actually, there's a lot of startups looking at this point of actually, can they do that some of technological solution to help businesses understand where their products and how they're being made, and give that transparency across the supply chain, so that when they get to the end, they actually know what's in the product and how to recycle it or reuse it. And so there are interesting opportunities here. And I think the more that we can grow the consciousness of the importance of this, yeah, I think consumers can shift on that. And so, yeah, there is a business opportunity here as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, and I really like the fact that we kind of started on the issue side of things, that we have problems, we're facing a lot of challenges. The CRMA proposal still has a lot of issues and problems embedded within it. But now we're talking really more of opportunities, of kind of the the solution that could be ahead. And there's a whole lot of opportunities out there. There's business models that are being built. There's whole ecosystems that are being built around these new topics and these new opportunities that are being brought by this legislation and materials. I think we still have some time. We slightly went overboard, but not so much. We still have a bit of time to take questions, whether from the audience or online. So please, by all means, from the audience first, and priorities to those who are in the room. Please.
Yeah, there were two here. So.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Diego. I had a question for the colleague from Aluminum. I was curious because I found it really interesting, the point on pre-consumer recycling and post-consumer recycling. It seems so evident based on the point that you made related to the aluminum cup. I was wondering, why do you think there's such a constraint to not actually realize what you have proposed? Is it a lack of knowledge from the politician side? Is it particular industries that are pushing against this, or I don't know, something else that's not included? But yeah, you're quite curious in finding out
that. Perhaps you can take the question from.
Hi, my name is Roberto. My question is very simple. Taking into account the timing of implementation of any measures in terms of promoting recycling, particularly, we're going to rely heavily on external partners in terms of providing critical raw materials. So my question is specifically, how do you see then which kind of instruments the European Union and member states may have in terms of ensuring more sustainable imports of critical raw materials, given the fact that in any case, the quantity of these materials and the necessity for these materials is going to increase in the short term. So in the next 10, 15 years, we are going to rely again and again of imports. So which kind of instruments, for instance, the global gateway could be an answer, or any other policy instruments we may have as European Union to get this necessity for keeping and even increasing imports of critical raw materials in the European Union. Thank you.
A tough question, Roberto. Thank you. Perhaps take the third one from the online audience.
Yes. So we have one anonymous attendant who states that recycling may save 85% of environmental impact, but it still takes away resources for future generations. So they ask, how can we embed more long-term thinking into circular economy processes or practices, particularly on raw materials, to make sure that there are those resources still for future generations?
Thank you very much. Then if I can turn to Justina for the first question, because we're addressed directly to you with some very concrete examples.
Yes. So indeed, there is a lack of knowledge about this topic. It's not, let's be honest, it's not a very sexy topic, and it's quite difficult to explain. Yes, definitely. But there are also some positive examples of this being picked up. For example, I only mentioned the negative example of CBAM. But if you take, for example, the end-of-life vehicles regulation, there the wording is perfect. So it does make a distinction between the end of life and process scrap. And at the same time, what we hear when we raise this issue is that it is just difficult to trace resources. It is difficult when you buy your scrap from a trader. Basically, stakeholders could not agree with us, tell us it is very difficult to make a distinction visually between what comes from pre and what comes from post-consumer scrap. And we do not necessarily agree with that. And we think that the need to trace what you're buying it's coming, and it will be a reality very soon. So we want to be proactive and we want to be forward-leaning. And this is why we are active also on this topic here in Brussels, but also on the business side. We are really raising awareness among our customers.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I would like to jump to the third question about how to embed long-term thinking on resource use, and especially for future generation. I was wondering if Sheba, you could have we could ask for your take on this, because this long-term thinking is something that should be at the heart of our policy making processes.
Yes, thank you. I think this is very good question, and sometimes you say that you can't demand in politics something that you don't know how to do it. Well, we do not know if the Ukraine is going to win the war or how we are going to make it happen, but still we are trying. It is a bit the same thing that if we give a bit of the leeway and we just, like we should have done with the fossil fuels ages ago, to set the date for 2030, after which you just can't use fossil fuels anywhere. And then you just better figure out, and that sort of a force comes as this kind of a source of innovation. So if you would sort of calculate the amount of resources you need to leave, and you would say that you can produce only goods if you have the reused material level uh, on 70, first 70 and then 80%. And if you would say that and that would come after guarantees what are the levels of the repairability, upgradability, and also the use time of be it clothes or be it electricity or be it whatever resources, then sooner or later, eventually, the market economy, that is a beautiful innovation because the business is always profitable. The question is only to whom and by what kind of incentives, and these incentives would form itself within a couple of years to be sustainable. But then, of course, I understand that it's a bit harder to do it only in EU, and we should have the partners to join us later. But if no one is pushing, then nothing certainly is happening. And I'm still thinking that we have so much short-termism, both in businesses and especially in politics, looking, well, can't do now, is expensive now, well, hurts our competitiveness, well, don't want to do, well, the others won't either, so I can't, well, and so forth. And you wouldn't do if you would be treating your cancer, that kind of excuses to visit the doctor or taking the operation.
Thank you so much, Shiva. So, question on the external supply, a vast one. And again, let me repeat myself that we will tackle this particular question with much more time to discuss it, with a full briefing to discuss it in the coming months. So please bear with us. Is there anyone from the panelists who would like to address some of the points that were made in the question? Or otherwise, I can ask the audience to if there's another, because we still have a few minutes to discuss more about the domestic aspects. Yeah, please.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not something that I formally worked on, and it'll be really interesting to see the report. But I suppose just musing on this point, I think it is an important one of what's the EU's role internationally, I think is the way I interpret it a little bit, because I think if we sit in I suppose that seeing it on both sides of, there's an image issue here of the European Union, and sometimes I think partners just look at the EU as some, and I've heard this a bit before, there's sort of these colonial vibes or something like that, and so it's something to be a bit careful of when we come with lots of rules and all this sort of stuff. That's not to say we shouldn't. I think that is one of the strengths of the EU, and my sense, just hearing some conversations, again, not as deep study, I think there are some international players that aren't really looking at these sorts of things, like the rules and the regulations and things like that, and how safe this stuff is. And so if you're a third country that are you going to go with the EU or something that's very easy? I think the answer right now is probably going with something easy. So what does the EU do? Well, my personal opinion is that I think in the long run, this approach of having strong rules is going to win out, but probably in the short term, it might not be the most popular. I think if you say, I don't know, start doing more deals with China or Russia or whoever, it's in the short term, it's very easy and there's a lot of funding and, it's all nice. But I think the governance issues are probably going to appear sooner rather than later. And I think as that happens, it becomes clearer that, you know, okay, probably a more rules-based approach is going to be better. So, I mean, as I say, it's a complex one. And how do we deal with that, with the fact that, you know, I'm just talking about the rules right now, let alone going higher. I think it's, I almost go philosophical with this question. I think it's really, are we going to stand with what we believe in and what we think is important? I think the sooner that we do it, and in the long term, people see that we really mean this stuff rather than oh, well, it's a quick reaction. I think we're going to have a lot more credibility in the long term. And that's going to be the route to, you know, having this, let's call it success, rather than short term, okay, let's just go with the flow or whatever. I think that's the only way that the EU can really stay relevant on the international stage.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, we have a couple of minutes.
Just, to shortly react on your point, I think maybe on the immediate term, there might actually be a combination of what we're currently doing here in Europe, which is indeed increasing the collection and recycling of waste. But indeed, if you make that available, or you encourage that, or you support that in third parties, that actually might be a really good win-win, right? And we're supporting third parties with their waste issues, and we're making those materials available that would otherwise be lost because of challenging waste management situations in those countries. So on the short term, it might not only be, let's create more rules for third parties, it actually might be, let's help them with waste issues.
So I definitely agree. The one thing I'd say is just that it's an image problem with the EU as well. People don't look at the EU and think, you know, I think US and China right now, you know, yeah. So that's the one thing about it that I think is just for us to play with.
To be continued. Absolutely. So I think we've reached our time. So it's my duty to actually close off this this meeting, this event. First of all, by thanking you very much for being here. Thank you, Shepa, for being here with us throughout this this particular event. Thank you so much for being here with us in the room. We're engaged in the twin transition. We're going to face unexpected increased demand of these critical raw materials in general. We need to put in place at the EU level a policy framework that covers the entire value chain, that provides an enabling environment throughout the value chains, from product designs to waste recycling, throughout consumption issues and information to consumers issues about the content of the product. And once we've solved all of this, value chains are global. The EU is not operating in a vacuum in all of this. And we will face a lot of challenges with our external partners, whether from sourcing, whether from supporting them into their waste management systems, and so on. So that's very much what's in front of us, how to think again holistically about circular economy in this whole world we live in. Thank you so much for being here. Again, this event has been recorded and will be accessible online. So by all means, please be watching again. Thank you.